Welcome to Week 5 of Europe from Poverty to Prosperity. This week we're going to look at the Great Depression, what is sometimes called the Second Great Depression, to distinguish it from the First Great Depression of the late 19th century. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the United States' response to that Great Depression, because that Great Depression did in fact begin in the United States, and then it spread worldwide from the United States to places like Europe. So let's start with this wonderful quote from a book entitled The Forgotten Man, A New History of the Great Depression. Their author, Amity Shlaes, says, "American capitalism did not break in 1929. The crash did not cause the depression." The crash she's referring to, of course, is the stock market crash of 1929. And if that did not cause, or at least explain, the long duration of the depression, then what does Shlaes and what do other authors and scholars think were the overall causes of this long-lasting Great Depression of the 20th century? Let's start with number one, which really does pertain to our world of Europe from poverty to prosperity, because it's a question of inequity of wealth. For decades, not only in the United States but in Europe, low farm prices had prevailed. And this was due to the fact that there was an agricultural revolution which brought many changes in farming. Farmers were producing more food than ever before. In Europe and other areas, farming had spread into the plains of the Ukraine, the steppes of Europe. So more agricultural production was occurring. And as that was occurring, there was obviously the price of farm goods decreased. And that meant that the debt that farmers had was increasing, and that they were also receiving low incomes because of the low farm prices. Now again, this had been happening for decades. On the other hand, industrial workers in the United States and other places, we find out that wages of industrial workers were not keeping up with productivity and with corporate profits. For instance, in the example of the United States, nearly 2/3 of all American families by the time of the Great Depression lived, now this is before the Great Depression, lived on less than $2,000 per year that economists estimated would supply only their basic necessities. So, 2/3 of American families were basically poor. In sharp contrast, the top 1% of income producers in the United States received 15% of the nation's income. So there was a great disparity in wealth, a great inequity, inequality of wealth. Partly that inequity of wealth would lead to the second problem, and that is largely credit problems. And this can be explained, and you'll hear it again in Robert Reich's Inequality for All, a documentary that you will see during the last week of class here, that the wealthy only need so many consumer goods and items. They only need so many cars, so many houses, radios, clothes, etc. So the economy was by this time really depending upon middle-class consumers. And increasingly, those middle-class consumers were buying consumer goods on credit. By the end of the 1920s, for instance, 4 out of 5 cars and 2 out of 3 radios were bought in the United States on credit. Personal indebtedness rose to an all-time high that could not be sustained. Now, we're not talking credit cards, which didn't exist then. We're talking credit for larger items. In those days, cars were larger items as they are today, but also were things like radios. So the first problem is inequity of wealth. The second thing, credit problems. Adding to all of that were agricultural problems appearing in the United States. As the economy was transitioning from an agricultural economy to an industrial one, some unfortunate agricultural and weather-related things occurred. There was bad weather in the 1920s, droughts. The Dust Bowl would come along. John Steinbeck would write his famous book, The Grapes of Wrath, in 1939, describing that. There would even be a major flood along the Ohio and Mississippi River systems in 1937. So compounding all of the other problems were these agricultural problems, problems of flooding and drought, etc. A fourth problem was that of international economic problems. You may recall from your readings that World War I, the end of World War I, had brought about the Versailles Treaty, which required very heavy war reparations on the part of Germany and other places. Herbert, later president, he wasn't president at the end of World War I, but later president in the United States, Herbert Hoover, thought that these reparations were a very bad idea economically. After World War I, there were high U.S. tariffs against imported goods into the United States. And in 1930, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was passed, which raised U.S. tariffs to an historic high, triggering an international tariff war. So as the United States raised its tariffs, other countries in Europe and elsewhere raised theirs. And of course, this led to more and more protectionism and even less and less goods being produced and sold. And the fifth problem was that of corporations themselves and the structural problems dealing with holding companies, investment and trust, and generally credit and leverage problems. And so to look at those in a little more detail, we're now going to go to the next slide, which really talks about how we led up to the stock market crash on Wall Street. And this is demonstrated here through a photo from the Library of Congress on Black Tuesday of October 29th, 1929. One of the problems was speculations. Investors, people like you and me, were speculating in the stock market, driving up prices. And as with all speculations, it creates a bubble kind of economy. And that bubble, as we know from our readings and our lectures thus far in this class, was a bubble that was bound to burst at some time. And it was getting ready to burst in fall of 1929 when bankers began shoring up the buying of stocks, but it was only a temporary solution, only a band-aid, and the bubble would burst. Again, due to speculation. We can break down that speculation further by discussing how people were buying on margin. That is, investors were buying stocks with just a fraction of the money down to pay for them. In some instances, they only had 10% of the money down. So in other words, if you were going to buy a $1 stock, that's all you had to do is put 10 cents down, and dealing with your brokerage company, etc., they would put up the other 90 cents, that is 90%, in the form of a loan. And that loan would be secured by the collateral of the stocks themselves. Okay, so, now that meant that if the stocks were driven down in price, and if they fell below a certain price, the banks or investment houses would literally do a margin call, requiring the investor to put up some more money. Now again, this buying on margin meant that you didn't have all of the money to, say, buy that $1 stock. You might have only had 10 cents of that money. By the way, today government regulations require that you have 50% of the amount to put down, but that is neither here nor there. Back then they did it. So you had 10 cents, and you buy a $1 stock, to make things simple, and that meant that you were borrowing 90 cents. Now, if that stock rose, let's say it rose over a few months to $1.20, and you went and sold it, you would not only be able to pay off your initial investment of 10 cents, but also the money you borrowed, and then you would have a little left over for yourself. But what happens if the stock price went down below $1? Let's say it went down to 75 cents, and according to your contract, at 75 cents, the loan, whoever held, the banks, investment house, brokerage firm that held that loan for you, would ask you to put up more of a margin. So it would literally ask you in a margin call, well, we need you to put up another 10, 20, 25 cents towards this. But what happens if you didn't have that 10 or 20 cents, etc.? You can see how things were all based upon speculation, buying on margin, etc. Now, buying on margin of stocks is actually an example of what we call leverage. And leverage could also be used by investment trust and by corporations to issue more stocks and to raise more capital. Now, you have to remember that corporations have stocks, right? And people own those stocks. Well, if corporations want to increase the amount of money they have in order to, say, buy new equipment, buy a new building, expand into a new area, they need to rely on capital. And if they don't necessarily have that capital, they might try to leverage it by issuing more stocks. And in that way, they sell those stocks or bonds, which is a form of borrowing, and they can also borrow, and they can raise more capital. Now, usually there's two different types of stocks. You have preferred stocks held by preferred stockholders who always get paid first if there's a problem in terms of dividends, etc. Then you have common stock, and those are the folks that get paid at the very last. Now, sometimes investment trusts, which were essentially holding companies that held stock in other companies in a pyramid-like effect, were buying up stocks in a particular company. So you've got companies issuing more stocks, you've got investment trusts and holding companies that are buying stocks. All of these are pyramid-like things. They're all using leverage. They don't have the money to buy these things. They're doing the same kinds of things, borrowing money, issuing stocks, selling stocks, and there's really nothing other than the stock prices themselves that is being used as collateral. So when the stock market went down and the prices of stocks decreased, this whole pyramid-like scheme, this whole leverage scheme began to be in trouble. Now, when the selling prices of stocks began their precipitous decline in autumn of 1929, brokers, banks, etc., began to issue margin calls or if not margin calls, they began literally to ask for repayment of the entire loans. Now, those who were able to meet those margin calls or repay those loans might do so if they had better priced stocks, stocks that didn't fall so precipitously, stocks that they could sell on the stock market in order to make the money to meet their margin calls or to pay back their loans. So those people who had some good stocks still could do that. But that in turn flooded the market with more stocks, which further drove down prices. So you see, it was a vicious circle. And the stock market entered what we might call free fall. And it fell quickly. Now, this shows you, and the sources from the Wall Street Journal Guide to Understanding Money and Investing, shows you, how it worked as of the early 1990s on margin calls. And again, by this time you needed to put up 50%. But it shows you what happens when people are buying things on margin and then the stock prices either rise or they fall. And this, I like to show you this because that whole idea of leverage literally can be shown by the physical concept, right? The physics concept of leverage and how this little guy here can leverage all of this weight over here, and it's through this pyramid-like scheme of where he's buying more than he can literally afford, and the rest is collateral on what he's buying and in the form of loans, etc., where the collateral is on the form of what he is in fact buying. Well, Herbert Hoover was elected president in 1928, and he said before that election in August of that year that we in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land. The poorhouse is vanishing from among us. 15 months later, he would live to regret saying those words. Those words would begin to haunt him as the nation plunged into the most severe and most prolonged economic depression in its history. What do we know about Herbert Hoover? Well, he was an engineer and very organized, a hero of his time. At the end of World War I, he was a food administrator for the government, and he organized the efforts to feed the hungry in Belgium, in Europe. As Commerce Secretary under President Coolidge, Hoover oversaw the successful relief efforts during the massive flood of 1927 along the Mississippi River. He also put together the cooperation of 7 states to build what became Hoover Dam. And that, of course, interested him greatly because he was an engineer. So he was an engineer, he was organized, he cared about people, he cared about the poor, he cared about those who were starving, and times were good. Unemployment in 1925 in the United States was only 3.2%. Now, another thing you need to know about Herbert Hoover is he did not like the stock market speculation that was going on. He thought, margins were a bad thing. Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon, under President Coolidge, was Coolidge's favorite, however. So even though Hoover himself, as Commerce Secretary, thought that all of this was a bad idea, nonetheless, the Treasury Secretary, Andrew Mellon, really got his way. When Hoover became president himself in 1928, and later the stock market crashed in October of 1929, Hoover was faced with trying to jumpstart the economy, and he tried to do this by persuading businessmen not to cut production, not to lay off workers, not to decrease wages, but this did not work. So then he proposed an increase in the federal budget to be used for a federal public works program, for new federal buildings, etc. He saw this public works program as being an expedient, a temporary expedient, and when the economic climate worsened, he became more and more worried about increasing government spending, believing that it would lead to a lack of federal solvency. As the Depression spread to Europe and the world in an international financial panic by spring of 1931, President Hoover became convinced that the Depression was not a national, but rather an international problem, and one that could not be solved except internationally. So he proposed a moratorium on all those war debts in Europe. He did create the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or the RFC, in the United States, a government agency whose purpose was to provide loans to troubled banks and railroads and other businesses. The problem was the Reconstruction Finance Corporation could not purchase stock or provide capital to those troubled businesses, and that's what they really needed rather than loans. Also, clearly not enough money was spent on any of the programs that the Hoover administration devised to try to solve the problems inherent in the first years of the Great Depression. As a result, shanty towns, literally shanties that were lived in by unemployed people, many of them riding the rails from place to place until they were chased out of the next place, sprang up all across the nation, and these shanty towns were referred to deridedly as Hoovervilles. Hoover had a rather sedate personality, which did little to actually inspire confidence. Some thought he was just simply unfeeling, or somehow removed from the realities of everyday life. In 1932, the Bonus Army marched on Washington, D.C. The Bonus Army was a movement of veterans who had served in World War I. And those veterans of World War I had been promised a money bonus in 1945. But they figured they needed it now rather than then. So they marched on Washington, they set up their campgrounds, and the campgrounds themselves were burned to the ground by General Douglas MacArthur, and the Bonus Army was dispersed. Clearly things are very bad. In the election of 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Democratic candidate, won against the Republican Herbert Hoover. Immediately, Franklin Delano Roosevelt began a spate of experimentation in what is sometimes called the first 100 days of FDR's, and we're going to refer to Franklin Delano Roosevelt as FDR's New Deal. On March 6th, FDR declared a bank holiday. All the banks were to be closed. Federal examiners would inspect all the banks in the United States. Those that were found to be solvent were allowed to reopen. And if those other ones were not, the RFC could loan money to the banks. On March 12th, a Sunday evening, FDR began his radio fireside chats. So every Sunday he would get on the radio, talk about all of the important domestic and international issues, and inspire hope and optimism in the American people who were quickly becoming addicted to radio. His administration saw the passage of the Glass-Steagall Banking Act. This was the second Glass-Steagall Banking Act. The first was under Hoover. And FDR's Glass-Steagall Banking Act was in June of 1933, and it created the Federal Deposit Insurance Company, or the FDIC, which guaranteed bank deposits to a certain amount and still operates today. In March 1933, the administration created the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, for men aged 18 to 25. The CCC worked on conservation projects in rural areas, for instance, building park trails and cabins, fixing soil erosion problems, reforesting, etc., and it employed up to 250,000 people. In May of 1933, the administration passed the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which established the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. This controlled agricultural production in order to prop up prices. That is, literally, farmers were paid subsidies to reduce crop production. For instance, there were limits placed on the amount of tobacco that each grower could grow. The U.S. Supreme Court declared the AAA unconstitutional, but FDR got around it by getting new legislation passed that allowed the government to pay farmers subsidies to reduce production for reasons of soil conservation, etc. The Tennessee Valley Authority was created in May 1933, and it led to the damming of rivers throughout the South for hydroelectric power, flood control, recreation, etc. One of their projects was Lake Cumberland in Kentucky. Also in May 1933, FERA, the Federal Emergency Relief Agency, was created. Directed by Harry Hopkins, it provided cash grants, not loans, but grants to states for both work relief and direct relief. Work relief, work projects. Direct relief, meaning things like cash payments and grocery orders. It ceased operations in December 1935, but by then it had provided $3.1 billion in aid and helped employ 20 million people. For the coming winter of 1933-34, it began the Civil Works Administration, federal work relief, that is federal government payroll, that did such things as construct schools, roads, parks, and playgrounds, and also did more menial things like raking leaves. Both FERA and CWA were meant to be temporary solutions, so they were dismantled later. The Securities Act of 1933, also in May. By this act, those selling stocks had to provide information about those securities. In June of 1933, the National Industrial Recovery Act was passed. It was headed by a new federal agency called the National Recovery Administration, or the NRA. It asked businesses to provide a minimum wage of 30 to 40 cents per hour, a maximum work week of 35 to 40 hours per week, and cooperating businesses proudly displayed the NRA Blue Eagle sign in their shop windows. FDR asked industries to cooperate in instituting blanket codes in their industries, for instance, the steel industry, for prices and wages, so as not to undercut one another, and in order to stabilize employment and to counter deflation. The NRA Charter also recognized the right of workers to form unions and to bargain collectively. The NIRA also established the Public Works Administration, or the PWA, that loaned money to municipalities and states for public works projects. The PWA did not do the construction itself. It loaned the money to states and municipalities, cities, to do that. Now, all of this is going to end because in 1935, the U.S. Supreme Court declared the NRA unconstitutional and the NRA ceased operations. They also established the Farm Credit Administration in June of 1933 and the Homeowners Loan Corporation in June of that same year, providing for the refinancing of mortgages at low interest rates. And then the 100 days of experimentation ended. FDR continued with what some call the alphabet agencies, because it's all like FHA, SEC, NRA, AAA, CCC, WPA, the alphabet soup agencies. In 1934, the Federal Housing Administration was passed. It insured low-interest mortgages, that were guaranteed to pay the lender if the homeowner defaulted. Between 1938 and 1941, FHA insured mortgages comprised 34% of new home mortgages, and it's still around today. 1934, Security and Exchange Commission, also still around today, was founded to oversee the stock market, to make certain that things like happened in 1929 did not happen again. Well, a number of workers went on strike in 1934, including longshoremen of the Pacific and a general strike in San Francisco, Teamsters struck in Minneapolis, textile workers in the South, etc. So the economy still was not good, and a second New Deal was begun in 1935 and after. And this was due to the fact that in 1935, the U.S. Supreme Court had declared the NIRA unconstitutional, and the NRA ceased operations. The economy did not seem much better by 1935. 20% were still unemployed, and there were the growing criticisms of what was being done. Some people felt that not enough was being done. For instance, Dr. Francis Townsend of California proposed a federal pension plan for Americans over the age of 60. By the way, that would soon become what we know as kind of Social Security. A Catholic priest, Father Charles Coughlin of Michigan, called the radio priest because of his radio programs, called for economic justice. He even wanted the nationalization of the banking system. That is, he literally wanted the U.S. government to take over the banks. Huey B. Long, the kingfish of Louisiana, a former governor of Louisiana and then a U.S. senator from Louisiana, he fought the power of big businesses, big banks, and he founded the Share Our Wealth Society. His Share Our Wealth Society proposed a massive redistribution of wealth in the United States. He wanted the federal government to tax the rich heavily, to tax inheritances. He wanted family fortunes of over $5 million to be confiscated by the federal government. And he wanted 100% tax on incomes of over $1 million per year. And in exchange, he was going to have that all redistributed. Each family in the United States was to be assured a house, a car, and an annual income. Well, the Share Our Wealth Society certainly sounded to many like socialism. So what you have to remember about FDR, although some people may regard him today as some sort of radical who brought about and increased the size of government, and it is true, government increased largely during the New Deal and World War II, and World War II was largely responsible for the growth of governmental bureaucracy in the United States. Nonetheless, there were people who were proposing very radical plans, and if you look at FDR in light of the time period, he really did propose something that was rather conservative and rather middle of the road, and allowed capitalism to survive. Because we know what was happening in Europe was awful in terms of fascism, of Adolf Hitler blaming the economy and things on the Jews, the anti-Semitism of Europe, the fascism that would appear in Spain and other places like Italy. So the United States took a middle road. In 1935, the National Labor Relations Act, also called the Wagner Act, was replaced. And if you recall, this was necessary because the NRA had NIRA had been declared unconstitutional. The new National Labor Relations Act created a National Labor Relations Board to ensure compliance. It gave workers the right to unionize and to engage in collective bargaining. Collective bargaining means that the union can act on behalf collectively of all of the workers in that union and sit down with the corporation, sit down with the bosses, and bargain as to what the wages are going to be. And perhaps one of the most well-known of the Second New Deal acts was one that has had lasting impact on our society down to today, the Social Security Act of 1935. It was a social insurance program that provided benefits not only to the retired, and so often we just associate it with the retired, but also the unemployed, the blind, the handicapped, and even dependent children. Aid to Dependent Children, AID, later on called ADC, was a part of Social Security, and it was passed in the following year in 1936. Another well-known program of the Second New Deal was the Works Progress, later changed to Works Projects Administration of 1935. It was renamed in 1939. It was directed by Harry Hopkins on the federal level, and between 1935 and 1942, the WPA spent over $15 billion in building new sewers, schools, post offices, highways, roads, bridges, and streets, but it also directed writers and artists and musicians, projects, archiving and catalog projects, etc. The National Youth Administration, which provided part-time jobs for men and women in high school and college. And in 1936, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the Agricultural Adjustment Act, claiming it was unconstitutional to pay farmers to curtail production. So the Congress passed the old AAA under a new guise called the Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment Act, whereby the federal government paid farmers to conserve soil, prevent erosion, etc., by not planting. Okay, so the election of 1936, FDR won. It pitted FDR, a Democrat, against Alf Landon, a Republican. And things would begin to change in 1936 and 1937. 1937, FDR was getting disgusted with the Supreme Court, and this was his famous attempt to pack the court by adding 6 more justices. And surprisingly, the Supreme Court, that he never got his way, obviously, began upholding New Deal legislation after this point rather than declaring it unconstitutional. By 1938, a minimum wage passed at the federal level established the 40-hour week and outlawed child labor. And what you have to remember about the minimum wage law, etc., this was a federal law. There had been states that passed similar minimum wage laws and states that had passed laws outlawing child labor, etc. I'm going to let you read in light of all of this stuff, to look at your readings and to tie them in with what is happening in Europe, and to know that the thing that really helped pull the world, but especially the United States, out of the Great Depression was World War I, although the Great Depression was certainly easing by the time of World War I. So thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions, feel free to email or phone me. I'm always happy to help.